Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. It's of course that strange music show where each and every week that really weird presenter just tries their best to talk about a different album, right? So in today's episode we are actually once again going to be returning to just fuzz, distortion, guitar pedal effects, just the stuff that I really enjoy in just loud, noisy rock music essentially. And so, in fairness, actually, this is a band that I have been meaning to look into and check out for so many years now, far beyond the history of weird music as it is. I've just been meaning to listen to this band and just never got around to it until quite recently, fair enough. Also, weirdly enough, this was the very first album I actually checked out by this band. And I have to say, I'm so glad that this is the one I landed on by sheer coincidence as it is, as it just ticks so many of the boxes of the kind of things that I adore in loud music, essentially. I'm really excited to discuss this one. Today, I present Lapsed by Bardo Pond. So let's of course ask ourselves, who are Bardo Pond? Well, Bardo Pond are a very strange psychedelic rock band originating from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania in the United States, featuring one Isabel Sollenberger on flute and vocals, Michael Gibbons on guitar, John Gibbons also on guitar, Clint Takeda on bass guitar, and Joe Culver on the drums. And together, having operated since the early 90s, Bardo Pond have created this incredible discography of very spacey, experimental, psychedelic rock that draws from a wide variety of different influences, that all combine together to create something that is ultimately them, of course. And as well as having released many albums under the name of Bardo Pond, the various members have all released so many different albums, all under so many different side projects and collaborations, further diversifying that incredibly strange output of just the whole project, essentially. As well as the influence of all these different forms of music, there is, of course, the influence of substances, of course. With a large number of Bardo Pond releases, both from albums to song titles, being named after psychedelic substances and other, substances, essentially. It's the kind of thing that speaks for itself, of course, doesn't it? It tells you a lot about the band and their ethos. But of course it also does explain rather a lot about the rather strange and esoteric compositions the band have come up with, as well as that kind of odd stoner rock vibe that, permeates throughout so much of the band's output. And so, what is Lapsed? Well, Lapsed is the third studio album from the band, released on Matador Records, recorded at Cycle Sounds, Philadelphia, and released on the 21st of October, 1997. And this album saw the band indulging in dirty, blissed-out distortion, creating an incredibly strung-out record that, feels very influenced by something, of course, right? Who knows, though? Who knows? Probably only the band knows. To be fair, on this album, a lot of the time it feels, a bit like the same sort of blown-out style you get with the likes of My Bloody Valentine, though a lot more distorted and dirtier and more stoner rock at times, I would argue, I'd say. It's just incredible fun to hear, though, and I love the use of the distortion and fuzz pedals on this record. It just sounds so good, the tones they get out of it. Pure indulgence of the massive sounds that stretch out so widely. So let's discuss it, shall we? So opening up with Tommy Gun Angel, you get such a loud deluge of distortion and fuzz almost immediately, being completely overwhelmed before the drums just drag that chaos into a semblance of structure. It's so blown out and joyous though, the way the distortion just chaotically rings out with all those fuzzy details. And of course as well, you get the most sublime shoegazy vocals over the top of it, which, as I've mentioned, it reminds me of the kind of stuff you'd hear from My Bloody Valentine, of course, who also utilised the use of a female vocalist for very dreamy, ethereal vocals, right? Only it does feel so much louder and oddly so much heavier on Bardo Pond's album, of course. I just love how everything is just so buzzed out beyond belief that the details are just completely scrambled, mixed it in amongst each other and just making it impossible to really discern what is truly happening at times. It's just effect after effect after effect, turning the guitars into these roaring machines that are screeching so loudly in your headphones. But of course, there is structure here though. It's not just pure chaos, but you get your verses, choruses, and even the odd little solos here and there, the actual semblances of song structures in amongst all that noisy chaos, essentially. And for me, I can't help but smile when I hear this one. I think, as an album opener, Tommy Gun Angel just works so brilliantly, as a perfect little album opener that, it doesn't really apologise for the bombastic attitude, but rather just revels in the joy of turning distortion up as far as it will go, and letting everything overload in a deluge of noise. And I just love how messy, dirty, and so full of this sense of dirge, and yet it is offset by those beautifully wonderful vocal passages, of course, that they just feel completely enveloped in this cataclysmic noise. Perfect album opener for how noisy it's going to be, and of course it's only just going to go from here, I think. And so from there, we do get the next track of Pick My Brains, which is a very interesting track after that really bombastic opening, of course. But of course, it's also delightful in its own right. This one opens up with a kind of picked acoustic guitar melody of sorts, whilst in the background, that roaring and screaming of the distorted electric guitar just whine out so precisely, before setting the scene for these very weird distorted vocals mixed into the song so bizarrely, like it's just sort of buzzing in like a fly almost, or a bee or some kind. And especially with how the vocals are sung, it feels so strung out, so hungover, as the song just pushes along this, this lovely medium tempo of sorts, a lot slower than the first track. But I have to say, what really puts a smile on my face is that chorus that the whole band sings of Pick My Brains, just low, moody, in the background, down in the lower registrars, almost just like, an afterthought as the head's just floating off that way, kind of thing. It's almost like an afterthought to the indiscernible lyrics of just Pick My Brains, essentially. But there's something satisfying about it, though. Especially with that fuzzy guitar just continuing this incredibly weird pattern in the background and all, just chaotically droning away with this unholy racket. But it's so incredibly weird. Like, there's something offset about the entire performance. Like, it's not quite lining up due to the influence of the many substances the bands are putting into themselves, of course. And it's truly pickled their brains into a state of non-understanding and just being like, well, I guess here we are, let's play our songs, I guess. But I think it does kind of give it a slightly humorous edge, though, and whilst also just being really satisfying to hear as well, especially with that overload of noisy effects that builds and builds up at times, especially in the chorus lines, before bringing it right back down to that pickled state of being. And definite highlights on this album, I have to say. From here, I think we get to what is most likely my favourite track of this whole album. It is the second longest track on the album, and that is the 9-minute long Flux. And so opening up with a squeal of distortion and feedback, the guitars almost attempting to find themselves in this really hazy atmosphere, before all suddenly descends into this incredibly heavy and slow riff that just pounds and pounds, starts up before going lower and lower and even lower, descending into that perfect final chord that's all the way down there. And the distortion is just so amazing and fun. I love how it sounds, especially when that riff just goes all the way to that low end part at the end of the riff, of course. There's just something so fascinating about hearing it, and the fact that, it's offset by really indiscernible dreamy vocals once again, it makes for an amazing listening experience on this album. Like, this one is kind of terrifying at times, with how heavy that riff is, but then with those vocals beautifully just humming almost away, really indiscernible as well, of course. It just creates such a bizarre contrast between the two states, but it's so brilliant how it comes together here. I have to say, it is kind of hard to hear what is being sung at times, but I don't know why. I kind of like the sheer fact, that certain little phrases, vocal melodies, somehow manage to climb out of the miasma for these momentary passages, just brief little words or instances, combining in that tapestry of just noise and distortion. It makes that indiscernibility, just kind of fascinating, I find. Like, the more you hear it, the more you discover it. And I have to say as well, this one is such a proper slow headbanger, though. Like, when I hear it, all I want to do is just standing in the middle of the sun, sunglasses on, just slowly rocking my head to the whole thing. Or that scene, from Homerpalooza in The Simpsons when the audience is just headbanging away while listening to the Smashing Pumpkins. I don't know why, it's just the image that entered in my head. In any case, though, what I love as well, this song somehow manages to keep that phenomenal momentum going for the entire 9 minutes of this runtime, essentially. Just vocals just quietly coming in the various channels as guitars solo over that deluge of noise. Just distortion, fuzz, chaos, essentially. What is nice as well, though, there's actually a very prominent feature of the flute as well on this one. That glides along rather unusual notes, even ascending into these really odd high frequencies at times that just climb over all of that distortion and noise, acting almost like, a parallel to the vocals in terms of what they bring to the composition, if that makes sense. But without a doubt, though, this is easily one of the most satisfying tracks on this whole album, and it's perhaps one of the main reasons why I've been so obsessed with it since discovering it. It's just so loud, so chaotic, and full of this phenomenal distortion that just proceeds at a perfect pace, I feel. A perfect, pummeling, just slow-ish, medium pace kind of thing. It's hard to describe that tempo, but it's just boom, boom, pushing along. But I love it as well, with how incredibly heavy this one is. It still slips in those incredibly ethereal, beautiful moments, from time to time, especially with those vocals, with those flutes, with those odd little moments there. Without a doubt, one of my favourite tracks on this album that is just, to be fair, full of absolute bangers, truth be told, It's crazy how brilliantly this album starts off, especially on the album's first half, just going for noisy delusions of distortion, essentially. And then yet it moves into the second track and does something slightly different from this before descending into this dark manicness of Flux, essentially. Truly fantastic, I feel. And so after all of that, after everything we've just experienced, we do get a kind of short interlude of sorts, which I think is much needed after all that. And it is the short track of Anandamide, I think that's how it's said, sorry. And so this one, it kind of feels like a very sort of mini jam of sorts, just an attempt to find a semblance of understanding within all that whiny feedback and distortion, And it's a very confusing track, of course, especially with these rather strangled, droning vocals that float over the top of it. It's so weird after everything we've just heard, and it feels so much more strung out, though, so much more hungover, so much, just of a place and time that is not within reality and just influenced by those substances, of course. It's so weird. But what I like is, it still feels like tying into that concept of finding control in the overload of distortion that so many of the songs have presented thus far, whilst also being a bit of a respite after the pummeling onslaught of those first two tracks. Moving swiftly along, though, we do get the next track of Greenman, which sort of brings us back to the normalcy of what this album is presenting us. Normalcy being distortion, fuzz, of course, which is coming up a lot in this review, of course, isn't it? This one does start off kind of quietly, though, with a slow bass riff, and it does feel like you're going to be headed into uncharted territory, only for that noisy distortion to just suddenly come back in and overload us all again, bringing us right back that frenetic pace, But what's interesting is this one has a very oddly glorious feel to it, though, especially with that bass riff combined with the climbing of flute performances, and the chords going up and up, of course. It feels like this is a track that's reaching up higher and higher, upwards and upwards in the hope of ascending to such great heights, like standing on the edge of a cliff, arms stretched out going, yeah, as the music just overloads you. It's a truly glorious track, I think. And it perfectly follows on into the incredibly loud and strange narrative that this entire album has been presenting to us. A joyous expression of the grandeur and majesty of fuzz and distortion, of course. And even with how zonked out the whole thing feels, of course, it just sounds so brilliant and so much fun to hear, I think. Next track, certainly another banger, of course, Straw Dog. And this one feels like a proper psych freak-out of sorts, that comes in and out with these floaty, indiscernible vocals, It's rather frenetically paced, feeling very oddly placed in terms of its placement, on the album, of course, but I think it works, to be fair with you, though. It feels like listening to one. It's like the speakers have almost completely blown out. The room reduced to rubble as the band just punishes the listeners with an onslaught of distortion and feedback, in the form of what I think is kind of like a classic rock structure for a song. I mean, especially with how all of the songs have presented themselves on the album. There's been some that follow that sort of verse, chorus structure, and then other ones that just do their own thing entirely. But this one feels like a sort of classic style, like, da 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 da, and then vocals and things like that and stuff. And everything within it just feels strung out to incomprehensible levels as well, though. And so the effects of whatever narcotics they've all just been consumed has resulted in the music sounding so wonky, so disjointed, but just brilliantly messy. One of the most absurd tracks on the album, but I love how it just ties in so nicely into the overall presentation the album's been offering to us. Zonked out noise, with a semblance of song structure in amongst that miasma. They're kind of sounding almost like the classic bands like 13th Floor Elevators and Space Band 3, of course, like feel that kind of structure, but just blowing it out with distortion. Very cool stuff, I think. And so from here, we move on to the album's closing track, which I have to say is an absolute delight to hear. The 14-minute closing track of Aldren, named after Buzz Aldrin, I would assume, I think. And so, after everything we've been presented thus far in this album, this track feels radically different by comparison, though, with everything being drawn down to a slow, spacey crawl, pushed along by this whimsical yet delightful little bass riff. And immediately it feels so much more stripped back, feeling to me like the kind of thing you might hear off of Beat by Barry Electric. Chilled out, cool vibes where you stick on the sunglasses and just drift off to the music, But there's some lovely vocals too that quickly introduce themselves, backed up by that rising drone of fuzzy distortion that feels, rather distant and far away at first, But it's such a cool vibe, I have to say, and one of the nicest things about this record, I feel. After what I would describe as being incredibly intense and densely layered fuzz, and distortion in the previous track, stripping all of that back, even just for a few minutes, just creates a wonderful point that we've built up to this album, A gentle plateau after the ascension following those, really frenetically paced noisy dirges. But that's not to say that there's no distortion, of course. It becomes so much more prevalent as the composition pushes along, when you get these little odd intermittent swells of fuzz, that rise in amongst that gentle vibe being pushed along by the bass and the drums. And the whole thing is such an incredibly spacey song, and once that feels so fluid into how it slowly develops more and more with each and every passing moment. A perfect little drift into the vast voyages of space, it feels, getting blasted more and more by the rays of the sun almost. And I do adore that slow build-up as well, and with it being 14 minutes, Bardo Pond really take their time and patiently let this one just naturally build up with greater presence from those guitars that seem to get louder and louder for brief moments before falling back into the recesses of those, that continuing playing beat. And I have to say as well, I love how gentle and floaty those vocals are, of course, There's a niceness to how they sound, these perfect little floaty notes that hang in just among the composition as the distortion and fuzz become much more intense and almost psychedelic at times before even the drums and the bass just, start, pushing it all forward even more frenetically, it feels. And it becomes that miasma once again, of just pure fuzzy drony rock music. Pure indulgence of distortion and fuzz that just rings out with that sort of wonderful chewy tones, I feel. And once again, I just love how this whole album is built up so brilliant to this point, like especially with this track just further pushing that build up across that 14 minutes. It's like when you get to those overloading delusions of fuzz and noise, it's harkening back to the preceding tracks on this album, all of which seem to have expressed so many different ideas and vibes while still tying into those same notions and ideas as each other, I think, and it makes for such a fascinating listening experience, I feel. And so, yeah, I have to say, I think this is a truly fantastic album, as you can no doubt probably guess by now. For me, I just adore albums where it just feels like a completely blown out overload of noise and effects, where all you want to do is just nod your head to the dirge. And a dirge this one certainly is at times, with such a descent into the sonic madness of effects pedals. It feels like, they've just let the guitars drone away with this phenomenal chunky weight as the riffs just push through it, creating for this amazingly loud, heavy album. And for something that does incorporate the dreamy qualities of shoegaze at times, especially in terms of how the vocals sound, it's amazing how purely heavy the whole thing is as well. Now, I would even go as far to describe it as stoner gaze, maybe, if that could be a thing. I don't know, maybe that's too far. But as well, I like how it's so different though. That fuzz and distortion does add to the heaviness for sure, but there's even scrunked out noisy delusions that strip back the intensity just a little bit, just so everything can fry your brain and frazzle it just for some moments. Weirdly varied, even with that consistent tone that carries across itself the entire album experience. It's just too much fun, I think. But definitely a favourite of mine that I've recently come across, And like I said, I'd been meaning to check out Bardo Pond for so many years, and randomly I just selected this one for no particular reason, and on being introduced properly to the band for the first time, I ended up stumbling on the loudest and dirtiest record they've produced. Probably, I think. It's an album though that, like I said, it just ticks all the boxes for things I just love in loud music, just indulging totally in the presentation of fuzzy distortion and just having a really fun time doing so. That is the other thing about this album, that it feels like everyone involved is just having so much fun playing these songs, and that's what I love about it. I just think it's really cool and something I've been listening to so much since first discovering it. I'll be honest, I don't have much of an idea if this album is particularly indicative of the band or not. No idea. I'll just have to check out more to find out. But I like what this one is though. I like this for just what it is, and I'm so glad this is the one I first discovered because it's just so cool to me. And so with that, I think we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Glad to have finally discovered Bardo Pond. Band I'd heard of, but never took the time to listen to, but that has all changed now. We got there eventually, and like I said, glad this is the one I landed on. I finally have some more blissed out distortion to listen to when the time is right. So I will say here, if you are at all more familiar with Bardo Pond and have been following their career and know their album stuff, then by all means, please let me know what your favourite album is by the band, so I can have more reasons to go check out different albums by them. It does, I have to say, I don't know why, but although I haven't as of yet listened to more Bardo Pond, I kind of wanted to keep this review almost contained within itself as just my one and only experience of Bardo Pond thus far. But when looking into the band and discovering more about them and stuff in preparation for this review, I get this sort of feeling and concept that their discography is kind of probably going to be diverse at times, I would say. Something I'll have to discover. We'll find out though. In any case, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.